Robert, you're muted.
I thought I unmuted myself, but I obviously did not. What?
You are now.
Yeah. Okay. So I assume the picture shows on the screen, okay?
It does.
This evening we will be having a presentation about Hawn's Mill by Paul DeBarthe and Michael Riggs. Paul DeBarthe began working at the University of Missouri-Columbia Archaeological Field School on the Homestead site in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1971 with Professor Robert T. Bray. He served as the lead historical archaeologist for over 20 years in Nauvoo, Illinois, and an additional decade in Caldwell County, Missouri. He spent 43 years as a public high school teacher and community college instructor, pioneering anthropology and archaeology curricula. He acquired his master's in anthropology with a specialty in archaeology from the University of Kansas. Since retirement, Paul has taken the time to re-examine the multitude of artifacts from many sites and is in the process of writing their stories. Michael Riggs was JWHA president in 2001 and 2. His MAR was done at Park University, and he has presented and published a number of peer-reviewed articles in Mormon Studies journals and 2 anthologies, and co-authored a paper presented at the Society of American Archaeology in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was the former director of the Far West Cultural Center, home of the 1837 Rich Log House, a forthcoming monograph. He is a professional public historian who has also worked on archaeological investigation projects within the United States. He has presented papers at the Missouri State Capitol, a Unitarian Universalist convocation, and at George Washington's Mount Vernon estate. Who is doing the prayer? Is that Paul or Deb? Deb, okay. It's all yours.
Okay. Thank you. If you'll bow with me, please. Our Lord and our God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to come together tonight and to listen to Paul and Michael's presentation. Lord, we're grateful for the many blessings that we've had today and the experiences that we've had with family and friends. We ask that you will be with us and bless our conversation tonight, that we might continue to do so with respect and to honor each one as your creation. Be with us now, we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Now, hopefully you can see the Hawn's Mill Hamlet.
Yes, we can.
All right. I want to explain that Mike Riggs is currently employed by FEMA, and he is in the process of being deployed. But the last I talked to him, he didn't know whether he's being deployed to Hawaii, to that disaster, or to Florida, to that disaster, or to another one that is not yet determined. But he was expecting to be available this evening. But the last I heard from him, he indicated that he had some things come up, and so might only get on for a brief time, or hopefully would be able to get on at least briefly. So we'll proceed with the presentation and hope that he's able to climb on, because I particularly want him to be able to share with you about his rather remarkable research on nits making lice. One of the phenomenal stories that's come out of the Hawn's Mill massacre, as it's most commonly known among Mormons, is the story of Sardia Smith being shot in the head and the murderers commenting that nits make lice. Now, his research on that is something I hope he's on to share. But in the meantime, let me lay the background and then proceed. Our book, The Hawn's Hamlet, a Phase 3 archaeological investigation report, including analysis of recovered material artifacts, is something that we expected to be out in May. It's been delayed, and I've scheduled it on the forum here 3 times now. And we were told last week that each of us would be getting 5 copies any day, our free copies, and we still haven't gotten them. And so I don't have the cover of the book to show you, but the cover is an early 20th century portrayal of members of the Joseph Smith family at Hawn'sville. And so we wanted to get a bit of history tied in there. I want to lay the background on a picture here of Governor Lilburn Boggs. And I put this background here because the question about what's the relationship between Hawn's Mills and the Book of Mormon is one that needs to be addressed up front. And I'm making that connection here because Governor Boggs is such a fascinating, such an interesting character. In 1838, October 27, issued the extermination order, and that you see the handwritten copy on the left. And on the right, I've bolded, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state, if necessary, for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description. Now, he wrote this shortly after receiving the news of the battle at Crooked River. And the Mormons had attacked the battalion from the state. And when private militia beats the state militia, that's pretty scary. And so this justified, in his thinking at least, Governor Boggs' action to exterminate the Mormons from the state. But they had plenty of other background pieces of information to support that as well, including research that Mike Riggs has done on the contracts at Fort Leavenworth for the Mormons with their firms, 1,000-acre firms in which they were bringing poor people in from the east, and they were working on the firms for a season and being able to produce a crop, sell that crop, and then use the proceeds to procure their own lands, expanding the Mormon holding. Now, the Missourians had an agreement they thought that made it so the Mormons would be occupying Caldwell County. The Mormons thought they had an agreement by which they occupied Caldwell County and proceeded to Daviess County and then on down to DeWitt, where the Grand River joined the Missouri River. And so therefore, we're taking over basically a big chunk of Northwest Missouri. Well, after the extermination order, Senator Atchison of Northwest Missouri pointed out that now that they had gotten rid of the Mormons, it was time to Mormonize the abolitionists. So interesting how harsh the attitudes were at that time. Governor Boggs in 1839 not only had gotten rid of the Mormons, he conducted something that gets close to my stomping ground because he sent the sheriff to go up in northern Missouri and collect the taxes. People in northern Missouri weren't paying their taxes as they should, and so he knew that there were six honey trees up there, and he sent the sheriff to go collect the taxes because there'd be at least $1 worth of honey out of each of those 6 trees. So the sheriff went up to northern Missouri, as he called it, and tried to collect the taxes. And the people in that area thought that they were in Iowa, not in Missouri, because there's disputed territory between the 2 states. Matter of fact, there were total 4 lines drawn. Part of this is because of the Des Moines Rapids, because the initial agreement for the northern border of Missouri was a line drawn west on the latitude from the Des Moines Rapids. But the Des Moines Rapids are 12 miles long. And so where in those Des Moines Rapids do you begin that line? Well, there got to be 4 different lines drawn. The Missourians, of course, claimed the top line, the north line. The Iowans claimed the south line. And so here were the people in that 13-mile zone who became known as the Hairy Nation. The Hairy Nation, because these were bearded, hairy, rough woodsmen, plainsmen who did not want to pay taxes to either Missouri or to Iowa. And that whole southern tier of what became Iowa counties then had 13 miles of the Hairy Nation all the way across the state. The primary focus of the war of the Honey War, as it was known, was in the east, but it actually reached as far west with people participating from Ringgold County, which is where our farm is. And so I've gotten acquainted with this as I've been working on the sesquicentennial for Lamoni. Lamoni doesn't come along until 1879, but by the 1830s, there were a few people settling in this area, and they got involved because with Governor Boggs getting the news back from his sheriff the second time that he hadn't brought back any tax money, but instead, presumably the sheriff had gotten captured by the Iowans, and so that made Boggs angry. He put together a military force of 1,500 men to go collect those taxes. The Iowa governor, the territorial governor, Mr. Lucas, put together an army of 1,200 to repel the Missouri army that he heard was coming. And so we end up with what's known as the Honey War, with these two armies approaching each other. One of them at least got 5 wagon loads of whiskey. Some of these guys didn't have guns, so they carried their pitchforks or broom handles, and they nonetheless met together and got drunk, fired whatever weapons they had, and had a lot of fun until December, when it got cold enough that many of them began to defect and go home because there were no guns being, not enough ammunition being provided by either state, not enough food. They're sleeping in tents, not very comfortable, and so there got to be some negotiations to see if we couldn't get things settled. The Missourians killed a deer, cut it in half, labeled one half with Boggs and the other half with the Iowa governor's name, and then blasted away both halves until they had shot it all up. And then they gathered up a few pieces and had a very military ceremony to bury the two. And therefore, they thought they were ending the war. So fascinating stuff. They ended up agreeing to allow the federal surveyor to come in and verify what the line was between Iowa and Missouri. That surveyor put the line where it is today, marking it every 10 miles with a big post that showed Missouri on the south and Iowa on the north. That line goes 3 miles south of our farm, and so it resolved a few issues. It means that one of the slave owners from Missouri that had moved into Ringgold County had 2 slaves that he ended up selling at St. Joseph in order to make it so he would no longer be a slave owner in Iowa. Fascinating little bits of history here, but it goes back to the irascibility of Governor Boggs. And because Governor Boggs had determined to exterminate the Mormons, and Mormon was simply a name that these people associated, the Missourians associated, the Missourian slave owners associated the name Mormons with the strange people that came to establish Zion, a place of equity in western Missouri, where people had slaves and didn't like the First Nations people. And so here came Mormons who wanted to treat slaves and First Nations people like humans. And so there was a very serious misfit. So, but the stereotype of Mormonism gave rise to this series of outrages, the Mormon War and the Honey War as well. Let's move on. Hahn's Mill is a battle site. And Governor Boggs issued his extermination order on October 27 of 1838. 3 days later, the Missouri militia, primarily from Livingston County, came marching in with roughly 1,500 men and attacked Hahn's Mill, which is rather strange because Jacob Hahn was not a Mormon, but there were a bunch of Mormons there. As a matter of fact, the Smith family had just arrived at Hawn's Mill from Kirtland, and they had taken a circuitous route, but had left about July 4th and had been crossing the state all this time, and finally got here in time to get massacred. The fact that we found numbers of slugs indicates there certainly was a battle there, and want to give credit for that. However, I want to also highlight that where Mormons refer to it as the Hawn's Mill Massacre, when my students were reporting to the Caldwell County Historical Society, they had the very sensitive position of reporting to a bunch of people whose ancestors had been in the winning militia. And to tell them that they had conducted a massacre, since the history books in Missouri don't call it that at all, then my students were in a bit of a bind. But I left it for them to decide, and it was fascinating to hear them presentation because they called it the Hawn's Mill Incident in the Mormon War. And I was real proud of them for finding a comparatively neutral way to address it. Here is the Shoal Creek that had the Mill Pond Dam and Hawn's Mill located close to where Loch Mackay is standing. Here are some pictures from this year, looking south from the gravel parking lot. It used to be that there was a teardrop driveway in front of my car. That's been blocked off now, so there's a gravel parking lot instead. And this is looking from the northeast toward the southwest. And yeah, we'll move on. If you go back to the west and look back toward that parking lot, you can begin to see the Ross cabin site. The darker foliage is marking where squares were dug by my students back in 2002 through 6. And if we go down, oh, here's another picture of that foliage looking to the north. You can see there's several of those square plots where the soil has been put back in, and so that gives a variation in the vegetation. And then down in the valley itself, just a little bit to the north of the stream, and by the way, the stream has changed its location significantly. Here is the mill race, or the pool area in front of us here with all the tall grass is where we think the gathering pool was. When logs came down the mill race, they would store them here before putting them through the mill for cutting. And here is a straight look at the mill race, looking to the west, and it would have joined the stream just beyond where that tree is bent. And looking from that same spot to the north, then you're looking across where the mill would have been, I believe, looking across the valley to the trees on the far side marking the roadway. And just this side of those trees would have been what we call the Ross Knoll or Ross Cabin site. Here's a map, and it shows you that the stream has changed. We can measure just on the basis of the history that we know that the stream has changed as much as what we can see here. And by the way, since I'm the only one presenting tonight at this point, if there's any questions that arise as I am going through, you don't have to wait till the end to interrupt to ask a question tonight. If you have one, you're welcome to. And this map might very well raise questions. But you see the loop here, which is the roadway I spoke of a moment ago. So now just above that, we have this parking lot that we just saw. Then here, the Ross foundations for the house. We call it the Ross Foundation because Ross lived there after the massacre. And because we know that was his house, then it's easy to put that name with it because we did find plenty of artifacts to give a demonstration. There was a residence there, and we have, I'll show some of the foundational debris that we pick up there as well. You'll notice off to the left here, then there's heat-treated chert and a fire pit. These are, I'm going to show you a little bit more later. This is the terrace area, the west terrace. And then down here, there's a proposed monument site, which I'll be showing you pictures of that. But here's the mill pond right down here. There's a little pool, and the mill race would have continued just about straight west to where it would have hit the stream over here someplace. Now, we thought the mill race would have gone back this way. So you'll see there's a red dot there with a diaper on it. We had the benefit of the services of David Hawley of the Steamboat Arabia fame, and they had some tools to help with studying the subsurface. And with his sensor, we discovered that about 10 feet below surface in this area was a large chunk of metal. And thinking that might very well be part of the mill, we got a backhoe and started digging from the current stream bank over here, digging back to the west. And we did not find very many artifacts, but at 13 feet below surface, we did find a plastic diaper. And plastic diapers don't date back to the Mormon period. And then shortly after that, we encountered the metal that was below that was 10 feet below the surface. It proved to be 50-gallon drums that had been cut to use as feeding barrels, like what my father used on the farm. And that's the kind of thing that was done 50 years ago. And so that diaper is giving you indication that in the last 50 years, the stream has moved those 20 feet or so to the east and also to the south. Let's see, anything else to highlight there? There's a fire pit over here. And this western portion of the terrace is where most of the Aboriginal materials were found. Then there are 20th century structures up on the north side of the road, but this is all a big field now. And while people have collected some artifacts there, those I think are incidental to the Mormon period. Now, I've not been able to capture very many pictures off the book itself, just the earlier draft, but just to give you the table of contents, generally, you have profiles and examinations, the mill race, bypass. Chapter 3 gets us the Ross residence on the knoll. Chapter 4, we put a chapter in about the high school volunteers, and then the field school with college volunteers that we had. And chapter 7, we get to compare the Mormon period sites between Adamondiaman and this one at Hans Mills. And then that's enough on that. Now the maps here will show you, and these are by John Hamer, thanks to him. But you see that Caldwell County was derived from the larger piece of territory that was part of what was known at that time as the Great American Desert. In August, when it's a dry season, walking across northern Missouri in the crunchy, dry grass made it known as part of the Great American Desert. If, like this year, you have lots of rain, then it's very productive. Also, this had been dry grass, and so it became an ideal location to put the Mormons, because the Indians had been starved out of there, basically, and so let's put the Mormons there. And so the agreement that the Missouri slave owner dominated government came to in 1836 was that they would divide up this territory and put the center of it as Caldwell County and give that to the Mormons. Well, the Missourians thought that meant the Mormons would settle in Caldwell County. Mormons agreed to settle there, but they also reached up into Daviess County, the northern portion of that territory. The Grand River ran through there, and so they established their town of Adamondiaman up here, and then occupied all the way down to DeWitt, where the Grand River joined the Missouri River down here. And so they really became dominant along Grand River for about 3 counties worth. Now, the Kirtland Camp group, which had Joseph Young's party making its trek, left Kirtland up here by the lakes, across Ohio, across Indiana, across Illinois, and they got to what is that town? They got to the Missouri River and crossed and then followed basically the route of Highway 24 from Palmyra all the way to Independence. No, the Youngs crossed to far west. At the same time, the Potawatomi, who had their village here in the middle of Indiana, were burned out of their village by the federal government. 870 some of the Potawatomi were then marched west under a certain amount of lock and key and under a great deal of restraint, allowed only to do a little bit of hunting on the side if the animals came up close to where they were being caravanned. And they were marched across Illinois. They were 3 weeks behind the Kirtland Camp group, and they actually camped in some of the same spots. And the Potawatomi then have left their markers because about 100 of the Potawatomi were died in the trek to Kansas. They'd been promised new reservation, new homes to build in Kansas, and so on the 27th of October, when Governor Boggs issued his extermination order for the Mormons, the Potawatomi were approaching Independence, Missouri. On the 30th, when the massacre occurred, the Potawatomi were approaching the Kansas border, where they were hoping and expecting to find new houses, but instead they got to find the Potawatomi Cemetery that's now in the downtown Kansas City, Kansas, and the good people of Kansas named a county for them. No houses, no beneficial construction, no good available food. And so two atrocities going on simultaneous here in 1838 in the state of Missouri. And I wasn't aware until we were writing this book that the two were contemporary, but both of them under the governorship of Lilliburn Boggs, who was governor from 1836 to 1840, at which point he got shot and Joseph Smith got accused of it. That is, his friend Orrin Porter Rockwell got accused of it. The Missouri Mormon Frontier Foundation was interested in this project, and we had the investigation of the Charles C. Rich cabin going on the end of the 1990s. And here came this request that we look again at Hawn's Mill, because beam was being exposed on the south side of Shoal Creek. So I, as the archaeologist, got a canoe and portaged the canoe over to the stream, down into the stream, and got this close-up picture. And from across the stream, it really did look like a large beam, a 2x12, sticking out of the bank. But as you can see, there's no wood grain in it. It is actually a natural chunk of clay. But it inspired people to get excited about the possibility of digging at Hawn's Mill, and so we did. We got Newell Kitchen with his ground penetrating radar to come take a look and tell us where we should dig. We also had some volunteers with their dowsing sticks come and tell us where to dig. I used the open-ended probe, and here you can see there's a black zone where the charcoal is, and that's, well, let's see, how far are we down? There with the fingers are marking the burned earth down here and the charcoal up here. So quite a lot of places where we used the probe, we found that there was charcoal down 2 feet below surface, and that's what you're seeing here. And so fascinating that there was so much charcoal showing up scattered across the site. Well, we didn't have a crew, we just had volunteers, and Mindy Crum was one of those volunteers who became one of our crew members. She and her daughter, Dessa, came regularly on Sunday afternoons and became part of our fundamental staff, so that we put them in charge of areas where the student volunteers were working. And we began to find, particularly near the teardrop area, we found a bunch of forged iron. And here you can see the long pieces of hand-forged spoke shave. It's all made out of one piece, and fascinating construction. Above it, or the big clump to the left of it, is a swage that fits into the anvil to provide for rounding metal. Then up at the top, you see some hand forged bolts, and in the middle are some hand forged scrap, and then at the bottom are hand forged tangs. So evidence that there was a blacksmith shop here nearby has us thinking that it probably probably in that teardrop area. Because the teardrop was traveled all the time, we had cars and buses on it. We could not dig there without jeopardizing the traffic pattern, so we didn't get to find any evidence of it. And the whole area has been plowed, so it would have been strewn evidence anyway. Now, we had a bunch of high school students from Shawnee Mission East High School who participated over the 4 seasons on this project, and that meant gathering at Panera's at 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, driving the 70 miles to Hahn's Mill, and working until about 5, and then back home again by means of stopping at Cameron for Dairy Queen. And it proved to be a remarkable experience because my students I think all of them found artifacts. And when a student found artifacts, they got more interested in history than ever before. So I kept track of the grades of the students that were involved and found that all of them scored 1 grade point higher in their social studies courses through the rest of their high school career. And so it convinced me that having students find artifacts is a great way to get them inspired with history. And here you see a bunch of them at work. This happens to be a case where you can see there's a good deal of rounding there. We had some piracy. Because we were only working on Sunday afternoons, sometimes people would come in midweek and dig around where we were digging, and the jeopardy, if you leave a piece of pottery exposed, then it may not be there the following week. And so my students had to learn to cover over the pieces of pottery and hope they'd still be there when they came back the following week. But pottery, and here's container glass, window glass, ferrous metals. We had 10 categories of artifacts, and I'm not going to show everything to you, but we had the earthenwares, the stonewares and porcelain, the window glass, container glass, the funnel, that's the bones and shells, the ferrous, the iron, metal, the hand forged materials particularly, non-ferrous metals. We had the synthetic, that is there were things like a plastic frisbee, and we had quite a number of condoms. In the non-ferrous category, we had, I think Bush was the dominant beer can type, but the Hahn's Mill site was a party site for local kids, and so there was quite a lot of modern evidence that came up in the archaeology as well. Let's move on. In terms of the faunal, here's bone. You see we had deer, pig, bovine, and rodents, all represented by the teeth and the bones. But the fact is that particularly on the Ross Knoll, just about every scrape of the trowel produced more artifacts. And so the kids really enjoyed it because they were finding things all along. Not only the ceramics and the metal, but here you see there's quite a number of fragments of limestone. These are fragments from the Ross House foundation. The fact the field had been plowed meant the foundation had been plowed out, and so only the broken fragments of the foundation were there. So we were able to establish within a probably 3 feet where the foundation was. It was a 1 rod by 1 rod structure, and we see at least the remains of the footings there to support that. And I'm sorry I don't have the name of this young lady, but you'll see that she's holding a very remarkable find. Yes, question. Go ahead.
Yeah, dumb question. How long is a rod? How long is a rod?
Okay, a rod is 16.5 feet. So 2 rods at 33 feet is a standard width for the roads in Nauvoo. 4 rods is a chain. And so when you chain out a mile, You see, the chains and rods were used by the Mormons, and one of the problems we ran into, because I started out with Bob Bray in archaeology, and we knew there was an English site, so we used the feet measurements, which unfortunately was a mistake. Well, David started analyzing it a few years ago, and he concluded that if we'd gone back to the metric, which was standard for archaeology, the metric system at 5 meters comes within 1 inch of matching one rod. If we'd used the metric, we would have been much better off, because we instead used the 10-foot grid. The 10-foot grid didn't give us nearly as good a match with the Mormon period measurement as the metric would have. So we've made that shift now in Nauvoo, but for many years in Nauvoo, the English system under feet was being utilized. So yes, the one rod structure, 16.5 feet square, was standard.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Monty. Thank you for asking. And any of you, please feel free to interrupt and stick those questions out there. Here's what that girl found. It is a piece of type. What's a piece of type and the letter N doing at Hawn's Mill? This we know that W.W. Phelps had the press in Independence, 1831 to 33, and then that press ended up going to St. Joe and ultimately to Colorado. But no type from Jackson County should have ended up here. But then Oliver Cowdery had a press that he took from Kirtland to Far West, and that was buried at Far West. And Far West was it 16 miles from Hawn's Mill? You shouldn't find type at Hawn's Mill from a press that's used only a few times at Far West. They use it for the elders quarterly, and only produce, I think, 3 editions of it. And so why would we find a piece of type at Hawn's Mill? I mean, this raises one of the more fascinating questions about the history of Mormon printing, because we have this very early printing in Western Missouri. The earliest printing in Western Missouri is done by the Mormons. This type is the most Mormon distinctive artifact that we could hope and expect to find, because the non-Mormons weren't printing anything. So it's a highly distinctive and unique piece, and it turns out a pretty nice letter N. And here we are with this fascinating mystery. Was it carried on somebody's boot and dropped 16 miles after they got off the wagon? Was it what was the press carried by means of Hawn's Mill, and type got dropped off the wagon that way, or just what happened here? So any of you that have a good explanation, you're welcome to raise it.
Paul, this is David.
Go ahead.
How about speculating that people could take a piece of type, like with their initials, and they could use that then to mark things, paper with their initials, just by carrying them in their fingers. And if they did something like that, they could carry the type great distances as basically like souvenirs, except using it not as a press, not in a formal press, but just with your fingers.
As usual, my brother, that's a fascinating idea. Unfortunately, I don't know of anybody using that kind of signature in the historical documents. If we find evidence of that, it sure would be a neat way to support what you're proposing.
You know, Paul, if anything about the type, the font type, typeface, and that kind of stuff, like, is that datable?
It's not datable, but this is the same font type that we found at the Times and Seasons. That is to say, it's the 6-point. This is a 6-point, and that makes it, what is that, 4 millimeters. And to be let's see, what's the 3-point ruby is the most common that we find on the Book of Mormon. And We have, well, this is the same type that we find then for the most part on the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo in the early 1840s at the Bain and Water site.
Is it compatible with either the far west that Oliver had or the W.W. Phelps Independence Press?
I don't know exactly. Now, this is part of the study that I'm wanting to encourage here because there's so much we need to learn yet about the LDS printing. You see, one of the very interesting factors here is that at the Kirtland Temple, there was a printing office which burned in I think it was January of 1839. I'd like very much to have the chance to do the archaeology at that printing office because we don't know for sure that the press escaped there. Matter of fact, the sheriff had sequestered things on the night that the printing office burned. And so particularly if there was a basement there, then that may well have fallen in and the press might still be. But in any case, there should be a scattering of the type there that we could compare. Now, that type would have been 1830. That printing office was working 1837, 38. And so there were two presses there apparently because Martin Harris got one of them out. And I think the other might still be there. In any case, we're talking here about the church having the press in Missouri and the press in Ohio at the same time. And this becomes part of the problem for them because you have power structures vying, trying to assert themselves and not being able to communicate. And so really it's an interesting chunk of our history. So to be able to trace and it appears that the type probably is the type that was produced in Cincinnati and was then used in Far West, then also back in Nauvoo. We do know that when Ebenezer Robinson went to Cincinnati, he acquired the type, and they also acquired the foundry so they could replicate the 3-point ruby, 4-point, and so forth. Up to 44-point is what we have found so far. So you have the italics, you have very varied sizes and types, and so there's just an awful lot we need yet to learn. I'd like to encourage more excavation of the printing experience at Far West, at Nauvoo, and especially at Kirtland.
Paul?
Yes.
The type itself, is it lead or is it some sort of alloy?
It's alloy. It's lead, and it has two other items: lead, tin, and alum. I'm sorry, there's another obscure metal that's mixed in there. We found the basic lead chunks that would have been melted down that got bypassed at the Times and Seasons building. But yeah, and the fact that they had the foundry and were able to find elements of the cast iron cauldron that they would have used. And we also identified some plexiglass that probably was in the doorway of the furnace that they used for melting down the lead and other materials for making their new type.
Seems like they would have used like sheets of mica instead of plexiglass.
Formica. Did I say plexiglass? Formica is what I meant to say.
Well,
Okay.
Terry has a question as well.
Okay, go ahead.
In the pottery that I make, I made a stamp with my initials that anytime I make a piece, I stamp the bottom of it with that. So I can fully understand somebody using a piece of type to leave their mark on something. And I don't know if the mill was just a grist mill or exactly what it is, but I can understand the idea of somebody initializing somebody with a piece of type, something with a piece of type.
Thank you. That's neat confirmation for David. Way to go, David. Yeah, the idea clearly is a good one, and it's one I had not considered. So thank you for bringing it up.
And the type could be configured in a hand stamp.
Yes, because when the copy that I made at the end there was simply stamped and put on the paper.
the mica in the stove was commonly called isinglass back when I remember seeing it in our pot-bellied stove in my one-room country school. And Paul, remind me, what was the type letter that we found on the Samuel Smith site?
We have two pieces of type on the Samuel Smith site. One was an E, I believe, and the other was an N, if I recall correctly.
Okay, neither one of them S's. So
No, and yeah, the fact that this one is capital is distinct. Yeah, the lowercase shows up much more commonly.
Well, now what occasion was there to be type on Samuel Smith's side?
All right.
Supposed to be
Isn't
a
this
pattern
fun?
here.
Isn't this fun? These tiny little pieces of type are such fascinating artifacts. What are they doing there? Well, understand that Hiram Clark, whose house was immediately to the east of Samuel Smith's house, was the one who made the trip back to Caldwell County in the spring of 1839 to dig the press up out from under the haystack at Hawn's Mill, at Far West, and then hurry back to Illinois with that press. And it was, of course, all dirty, and so Ebenezer and Don Carlos had to clean it up, and cleaning up the type is such an onerous task. They tried apparently, but that one of the first things that they did was to raise the money so they'd go get new type in Cincinnati. And that story that's the burning in the bones story from Ebenezer Robinson, who was walking to the Times and Seasons and had this sudden inspiration that he really needed to reprint the Book of Mormon. And so they raised $200. He went to Cincinnati and was able to get the 1840 stereotyped. And then they brought that back to Nauvoo and produced it at our site as well. So our site did actually produce the Book of Mormon there. And David and I will bring that up again when we talk about the swamp at Nauvoo, because that second Times of the Season site was built over a basement that would have been dug in a swamp. And you don't dig a basement in a swamp. So again, that's one of the evidences that makes the swamp highly suspicious. Anyway, I'll move on unless there's more questions. All right, here's some transfer printed earthenwares. And you'll notice the blue, the red, the mulberry. And off on the right, you see a transfer printed ware on a red pottery. Redware doesn't normally get that kind of nice decoration, but there we have a strange sample. A few buttons, but notice this is an 1845 button made of brass, which of course dates to the post-Mormon occupation. And so one of the problems that we face here is that we have an extended span of evidence of occupation on this site. Here, for example, are a couple of beads. These are not likely beads that were worn by the Mormons. Much more likely beads worn by the Aboriginal folks. And that orange bead, which appears to be coral, would have come undoubtedly from the Gulf of Mexico. And it's matched in size with that black bead, and the black bead in particular shows a significant amount of patina and wear on the exterior to suggest that it was actually worn quite a bit. But here we're talking about probable importation of cultural materials, very likely because the other things we found some 2,000 years ago. The Shawnee Mission East students dominated the Sunday afternoon excavations for 4 seasons. And it was just a remarkable experience because they were enthralled by it. Parents that would drive would come and get involved as well. And so it proved to be a very interesting experience for everyone. Here you see, for example, the artifacts from one square, one level in one afternoon. Whole bunch of square nails, some glass, window glass, some decorated pottery, some stoneware over here, stoneware bowls and pots found. And of course, we asked the students to record and map their artifacts. And so here you see that in process. we did also ask them to record, to get a permission slip signed, so that was a significant part of the process. Here we are with a piece of brown transfer print, and it has a tower on it. So it's almost enough to be able to identify the design and potentially the maker, but so often when you're looking at thumbnail-sized pieces, you don't get enough to be able to identify the marker. And in this series of excavations, while we got a number of maker's mark fragments, we did not get any maker's marks that were absolutely identifiable. Now, I do want to highlight the fascinating comparison, because in 1980 to 82, Ray Matheny conducted an investigation at Adam on the Hawn, Ray and Mr. Carter. And they came to Nauvoo to see what we were doing at the time, and they spent evening with us in the mansion house, and then proceeded to spend the day with us on the dig. So Rena and I went to Adam on the Hawn to see what they were doing, and it was phenomenal because they had all kinds of equipment, and it was just awesome to see their lines of electric probes and so forth, where we were using manual probes. But as it worked out, the manuscript that Ray Matheny and Carter put out did not agree with the projections of the LDS Church, and so it never got published. Joseph Smith was reported to have identified Adam on the Hawn as the place where Adam had his altar. Mr. Jackson had a large bunch of stones on the plot of land that was given to him, and he was disappointed because the other people got better land for growing things. Joseph Smith explained to him that he had Adam's altar, and so that was a very good means of pacifying him. Well, I'm showing my predisposition towards suspicion of the whole Adam on the Hawn story, but the idea that that was where the Garden of Eden was something that the Mormons wanted Ray Matheny to support, and so he excavated that altar and found that it was only about 1,000 years old, and so that publication got buried, but it was released to me, and we were able to get a photocopy of it. And fascinating, because he had 25 sites that they worked on in the 2 years that they worked on that site. And one was the Lyman White home site. Well, actually, two of them were Lyman White's home sites. But Lyman White had only spent a couple of months in the first one, and that had been occupied for several years earlier, and then was occupied again later. So the Lyman White period could not be distinguished. But the second Lyman White house was under construction when he was captured and put in prison with Joseph Smith. And when Ray Matheny was doing his study, I think that he did not know that it was not actually occupied by Lyman White. And so they took it all the way down to bedrock, even through the cracks between the in the limestone outliers, and were able to retrieve everything in that house. And there were just a very significant number of artifacts. And one that he identified as peasant ware was hand-painted wares. And so from you can see the red on the left and the green above it. Those are hand-painted from Hans Mill, what Ray Matheny at Adam on the Hawn was calling peasant's wear, this rather rough, coarse hand-painting design. That what he called peasant's wear was not something I was acquainted with until I was able to read his article, and then associated with what we had found at Hans Mills. But yeah, there it is. And so beginning to understand, we thought that very likely was Mormon period. It is Mormon period, but Lyman White didn't live there. He was in prison, and the building was not finished until after he left and was out of the state. So his successor finished the building. And so again, being able to distinguish the Mormon period artifacts from the earlier and later occupants becomes virtually impossible. Only if you have diagnostic artifacts like those pieces of type does it become clear. Terry, I see a hand up.
George Miller called that peasant wear that with the green and red painted things gaudy Dutch. And so I don't know if that's a broad categorization, but that's what he called that stuff. And it was fairly common in Nauvoo.
Yes. Yeah, rather common in Nauvoo, but quite common in BOM The Hawn, according to what Ray Matheny found. But yeah, interesting how same wares get different names, and so you have to try to figure that out. And I was pleased. I had the pleasure of having Ray Matheny come to Nauvoo back in, what was it, 17, and to renew the friendship just a couple of years before he'd passed. Just a delightful human being. He signed a copy of his book for my grandson, the book of his being shot down in Germany over World War II and surviving Auschwitz. Yeah, a tremendous human being. All right, here's DeBarthe using the GPS
Hello?
to mark the artifacts for the three-dimensional map. Question?
Yeah, this is John Watts.
Hi, John.
I really don't want to go off track from what you're doing because you're doing such a very interesting job. But this Adam Ariande, is that something that the LDS Church believes to be because of artifacts, or is it because of something Joseph Smith said without artifacts? Or
We
maybe
have
you
several
don't.
members of the LDS with us that can correct me if I'm out of bounds here, but my understanding is that because Joseph Smith stated that this was where Adam had his altar, that this was the Garden of Eden, or this is where he was when he left the Garden of Eden, I think is the way he announced that story. It's a little difficult for me to understand that the Garden of Eden had the Tigris and Euphrates rivers running through it. And then when Adam left, he made it to Missouri. And so because I have that difficulty, then I would be happy to yield to anyone who has the belief system better in hand for the LDS to express it.
Okay, so it's really not based on any artifacts, just something that Joseph Smith apparently said.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Yes, I agree.
That was Terry?
Yes.
Right.
I think that's the church. I don't know if doctrine's the right word. That's the belief in the church that Joseph Smith said that. And so it's been believed for all these years.
It's a little bit like the belief in Nauvoo being in a swamp. All right. Excuse me for chuckling at that point, but I do find it rather humorous that our belief systems sometimes counter our best science. One of the intriguing student projects was one of my high school students studying the musket balls, and he wrote a paper that we've included in the book just to demonstrate the kind of work that you can expect from high school students. And part of our intent here is to set a paradigm by which to encourage future investigators to use high school students and college students as volunteers, as crew on such investigations, because they can really do excellent work. I found, for example, that 10-year-old girls working with their parents on the site tend to have the sharpest eyes. And I've had several occasions in which tiny gems that fell out of people's rings were found by one of these 10-year-old girls. It just amazes me how frequently that's been the case. All right, I'm going to move now to the university participants, and I'm going well over time here, I'm sorry. But the western portion of the site had quite a lot of cultural material. And of course, we initially thought we were looking at Mormon period material, but the more we dug, the more we discovered that we had materials that predated the Mormons, below the plow zone. And so these are these are Northwest Missouri State University students, and you're seeing some of the features that they found. Now, I'm not spend a whole lot of time on them because we are dealing here with First Nations prehistoric materials. circular hearth here in a trench that produced a large quantity of grit-tempered, cord-marked pottery, characteristic of the Middle Woodland period. And here you can see one that's freshly washed, where the cord marking is quite clear. But this puts it back about 2,000 years. And so with a 2,000-year-old occupation showing up repeatedly across the same site that the later Mormons occupied and called Hawn's Mills, interesting correlation that, well, while I don't want to make any association with the Book of Mormon on it, I would say that we're clearly dealing with Book of Mormon contemporaries. And here you can see the trench that they opened on the west terrace looking north. Here is one of the students with a circular Aboriginal feature. We found quite a lot of lithics, and you can see the oval biface here. The oval bifaces are characteristic of the Middle Woodland period, and so that's another reinforcement of the diagnostic period here. And this dark chert is of the same type that we found with a Dongola oval biface in Nauvoo, which struck me as very interesting. I don't have a very good picture of it here, I'm sorry, but at the bottom center, you'll see the base of what I think is a Hickory Ridge projectile point. And that would be the earliest piece of lithic material we found. It will date to the Middle Archaic, that's 7,000 to 5,000 years before the present. And so to have at least 5,000 years of occupation at Hawn's Mills is another reason to protect that site and appreciate that it has a living legacy that's tremendous. Here's Michael Riggs, because as the historian, he also took the students to the museums and libraries, and so they got a pretty heavy dosage of education in the long week that they spent with us. But in the archaeology part, because they came up with these subsurface features, we ended up doing some water screening. Water screening, you take the floated material down to the water, and charcoal will float, so you can screen it off and get a check on possible charcoal samples. Although, of course, we never had the money by which to process that. But the students found it fascinating to be able to submerge the mud in the box and have the little things float up. You get the dirt to fall through, and then all you have left is pottery and bones and other cultural material at the bottom of the screen. So it's a fascinating research strategy. Here's a trench that went through to expose one of the features. Here the young ladies in the process of clearing out the materials to be water screened. And here's that feature at the conclusion. And one of the things that we found there were several pieces of catlinite-like reddish stone. And this is the kind of material that was frequently used for making pipes, but commonly associated with virtually all periods of the Aboriginal occupation, but particularly with the Middle Woodland. And here's Riggs with that crew finishing up the season. Now then, the last chunk I want to show you, we found that there had been an intrusion. Some people brought a backhoe into Hawn's Mill unauthorized and went digging for the mill, for the well site. And this is where they dug. And so knowing where they had pirated, when the question came, where could a monument be set? I determined that if we cleared the area for where it had already been disturbed, it'd make the most sense to use that as a location for a monument that could help commemorate the incident in the Mormon period war. So here we have people shovel scraping to get through the soil, the plow zone, and shovel scraping in that plow zone was let's see, that's a 20 by 20. It's 4 10 by 10 foot squares. So that made a pretty big zone by which to plant a monument. My friend Dan Orn from Pennsylvania found this first piece of burned granite. The burned granite came from being sloughed off the granite grinding wheels for the mill, for the grist mill.
Yeah.
And so fascinating to see it. Got a
Careful.
question there, Ron? Okay, here's that process just about finished. And here you can see some of the burned granite, reddish stain on the granite. There's indication that it's burned. And it's also softer, more friable once it's been burned. And then in conclusion, we do have clear evidence that there would have been probably both a grist mill and a lumber mill at Hahn's Mills. So Hahn's Mills is the appropriate term. And so we've studied the milling process, and it appears that there must have been on Shoal Creek at Hahn's Mills a three-story mill for grinding the grain, the grist, because once you ground it the first time, you pump it up to the top floor, bring it back down to be ground again into finer grist, and that way you can repeat that process until you have it at the texture that you want. And so to be able to have, this is Ron Romig's handmade drawing on a napkin that we captured, but Ron Romig has been a regular contributor to our project, and I wanted to give him credit here. But here's the bypass waterway in the mill race. The stream was over here. He shows the mill reaching out north of the stream, north of the bypass, and I think that may very well have been the case. Generally, we've been looking for it south over here, but Ron Romig's proposal, it's this way, makes more sense because having now visited the mill at the next mill down the river that has the walls still standing, it's 2 rods by 1 rod in dimension. So it's very likely this was that big as well. And most of the stone will have been pirated, so we have not found the footings for that mill yet. I see a hand over there, and this is the last slide, so I can't tell who the hand is. Oh, John Watts. John Watts, need to unmute to ask or comment?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Just a general question, and I know you're done, so I don't feel too bad about asking this. When you go into an area that's, maybe close to 150 or 200 years down the road, do you expect there to be a lot of sediment erosion or buildup in that area, or is it pretty much the same?
At Nauvoo, for example, on the flats where I spent most of my time, we can expect to find most of the Mormon period material at the 6 to 10 inches below surface. So that is about a half a foot of sedimentation that has come in the last 150 years.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Good question. Yes, and I'm open for any other questions. And I'm sorry, I still haven't seen Mike Riggs, but if he's here, then let's get him on.
I've not seen him unless he came in as an iPhone.
Okay, well, he would speak up, I think, if he did. All right, Bruce. Actually, I should yield to Deb here because she's practiced at this and I'm not.
Oh, you're good. Don't worry about it.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Okay. Alex Baugh has done research on Jacob Hawn and feels that the Jacob Hawn, who was buried in Oregon later at death, was spelled H-A-U-N instead of the H-A-W-N. What do you feel about that?
We have at least 5. I think Mike has found 5 different spellings of Jacob Hawn's name. And so I don't know what to make of it. I think you're right that Alex has been very clear on identifying Jacob Hawn as not being Mormon. But he was taking advantage of the fact that the Mormons were coming in and would be building, and to be able to have a mill that could not only produce the grist, but especially to produce the lumber that they needed for building their houses was a highly significant economic effort on his part.
Thank you.
Okay, Terry, go ahead, and then Rick.
I have two questions. One, I'm familiar with Zion's Camp. I'm not familiar with Kirtland Camp. So if you could explain that to me, I appreciate it. Second question is, years ago, a budding historical student that I worked with indicated that the Boggs extermination order was a reaction to a 4th of July sermon by Sidney Rigdon, who basically said something about exterminating the Missourians. Has anybody else heard that idea?
Let me take the second one first. And yes, that is correct. The Sidney Rigdon sermon did mention extermination, that there would be a war of extermination. One or the other would be wiped out. And so that kind of vernacular clearly can be cited as a historical stimulus for Governor Boggs' response. Your first question. What was your first question?
Kirtland Camp.
Kirtland Camp is a pretty substantial group of people that left Kirtland about, I think, the 2nd or 3rd of July in 1838, and most had gone on ahead, but the young group had taken a slower route and arrived at Hahn's Mill later. The Kirtland Camp group mostly went to Davies County to settle, and were already there before the Young family arrived at Hahn's Mill.
Thank you.
The gentleman, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, but the gentleman who put the remarkable book on the historical sites of Missouri, I believe cites the Kirtland Camp group.
Rick, go ahead.
So I don't know who asked the previous question, but my understanding in talking with Alex Baugh was just the opposite. They had been spelling it Haun for years, and then Alex found that Beverly Cleary, the children's author, her grandfather, I think Beverly was like 100 years old. I think she just barely died. But her grandfather was Jacob Hawn, and it was spelled with a W. And so anyway, I think it was just the opposite of what that question was, and just wanted to clarify that point. So not really a question, but more of a comment there.
Rick, was Beverly Cleary related to the Hawn of Hahn's Mill?
Yeah. Jacob Hawn was her grandfather, is my understanding.
Wow.
Because I interviewed Alex a couple years ago about Hahn's Mill specifically, and they had been looking for Haun, and then when he found out Beverly Cleary was related to him and it was spelled Hawn, and so I believe I was out there last summer, or whenever it was. I can't remember when I was there, but anyway, a year or two ago, and the LDS church signs were now spelling it Hawn, whereas previously they'd always spelled it Haun. So, and I'm pretty sure that was because of Alex Baugh.
Well, and Michael Riggs and Alex Baugh are close enough buddies that Mike, I'm confident, has picked up that more recent information. That's why we're using that spelling. But I think our book does list 4 or 5 different spellings for Jacob Hawn.
And I've been spelling it with the W from now on too, because I think that's the more correct spelling. So
thank you. I appreciate that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Monty, go ahead, please.
Well, Paul, this question is actually a request, and it's totally non sequitur. But there are 2 books that I would like for you to write just for me. One is called Particle Physics for Dummies, and the other one is called Archaeology for Monty.
All right. Blair Bryant is writing the Particle Physics for Dummies. So I'm confident that you can, in fact, I think is putting that online. And so I'm going to yield to his genius on that one. Now, Archaeology for Monty, I just gave you the first chapter tonight.
Oh, okay. Well, now I know what a rod is.
Well, there are the irony of it is that I didn't realize the significance of the rod until just a little bit too late. I did miss getting the last picture on, so let me kick that one up here. I wanted to highlight that we had an awful lot of volunteers, and the fact that we had high school volunteers for four seasons, college volunteers for one season. We had volunteers from the LDS Church, we had local and regional volunteers. We had restorationist volunteers, people from the Community of Christ, and we wanted to say thank you to all the volunteers. Our appendix has about 170 of them pictured, most of them without their names, but we hope that will help sell more of the books. Book is $29.95, and it should be out this week if I have. Well, except I've been saying that now for how many months? So, but it should be on Amazon within a few days. Okay, other questions or comments?
There were several comments in the chat in regards to the hymn that was in the LDS hymnal regarding the garden. So if folks want to take a look at that.
Paul, do you know if the people who were killed at Hawn's Mill, were they also buried in that area?
It appears there's 17 that were killed there, and most of them appear to have been dumped in the well. Mike and I very carefully avoided finding the well. Let me explain that, because the thousands of people who are descended from the members who are buried there all feel they have some right to that ancestry. And our feeling is that this is a little bit like the battleship Arizona in Honolulu Bay. We know the people that were buried in, there are 2,000 people that went down with that ship. We know their names, but what better monument can there be than the monument that's there with the ship itself? And so to leave the well, my inclination would have been, if we had stumbled upon it, I would like to have approached it from the side, leaving everything intact, but getting the full vertical profile of it, marking the site, and then protecting it so that it could not be disturbed. But what we have done is not found the well, and I'm not going to encourage the present owners to find it. I think that it is, we do have additional information to guide people that might want to explore it, and we have several thousand artifacts that as you look at the clustering of the artifacts, begin to offer some guidance as well. But the advantages of finding it versus the disadvantages of finding it are such that we carefully avoided it and recommend that strategy for the future. Rick, I got a hand up there again.
Yeah, I just know a lot of people that were very interested in finding it. So it's interesting to hear your perspective that you kind of purposely were not looking for it. Are you aware of any other efforts to find it, at least? Because I know a lot of people would like to see some sort of a marker there where the well was, but.
Well, Price and Harkrader, who are part of the restoration movement, did some digging at Hawn's Mill in the early 60s. There was a Corps of Engineers proposal for a dam at just down the river, down the Shoal Creek, that would have flooded Hawn's Mill. And so Price and Harkrader proceeded to put together a plan to salvage. And they really did a lot of work, but among the other things they did, contacted several of the archaeologists in the area, Bob Bray included. Bray went there and made his recommendations, and his letter is in our book. Unfortunately, his recommendations were not necessarily followed, and we have the report from Price and Arkwright that they found the well. Well, I don't think that is correct. I think that they found an Aboriginal deposit, probably, because we know that there was an Aboriginal village there as well. We do have, I mean, as I indicated, there was a team of illicit people that went in with a backhoe where they thought the well was going to be. I have calculated on the basis of the steps to be taken from the Ross house, because he indicated that the well was a certain distance from his house, and he would have been catching the odors from the dead because he was there after the burials and after the thaw, and so it was obnoxious to him. It was bothersome, and so the well is closer to the Ross Knoll than I think most people have been looking. I'm not going to say any further than that. The fact that
you're sure that the excavator, that's not the site?
I'm sure that the excavated site was not correct for the well.
Okay.
I think it may very well have been very close to the mill, because well, where we put out the 20 by 20 square for the monument, that because all the burned granite that we found there, that I'm confident that's where they were preparing the mill wheel, and you don't want to carry that mill wheel very far after you prepared it, and so it's going to be close to the mill site. The fact that we have all the charcoal there from them burning the surface of the granite stone to be able to better flake it down and get it to the precision that it requires. That it's a fascinating project to produce a mill wheel, and you have to have the two faces have to come together, and they only have allowance of about 1/1000th of an inch, because those grooves have to catch the grain, and there's more space in the middle, in the center of the wheel, than when it goes to the edge. You only got 1/1000th of an inch for that grain to creep out, and so the grinding of the wheels, which are carefully cut to make it so the grain will slide out. The magic of the mill wheel producer is just a remarkable bit of technology.
Thanks, Paul.
Paul, there's been a request for you to put the details of your book into the chat. Do you have information on your book?
$29.95. We're supposed to be getting free copies, and it should be listed in Amazon presumably this week.
What's the title again, Paul? This is
here. Let me pull that up for you. It's Hahn's Mill Hamlet. A Phase 3 archaeological investigation report, including an analysis of recovered material cultural artifacts. John Whitmer Books, Independence, Missouri, 2023. I don't have the
W or a U?
Sorry?
Is that with a W or a U?
Whitmer?
For Hahn's Mill.
Oh.
H-A-U-N or H-A-W-N?
We have it with a W.
Okay, good.
He's trying to take Monty's place.
So, and I don't know if I should put you on the spot here, Paul. Should I email you about doing an interview at Whitmer? Or?
Well, or maybe we just show up.
Well, I'm bringing my equipment. Debbie's going to be my Sherpa.
Am I?
Okay. All right.
Hey, Rick, all I can tell you is that's a very unenviable goal.
What's an unenviable goal?
Emulating me.
Oh.
I am looking forward to flying to Texas and being there to again, it looks like Mike is going to be deployed, And so the two of us were supposed to be there to sign books, and I haven't figured out how to write his signature yet. So it may just be mine that people get.
Okay. So is Mike not going to be there?
Mike is in the midst of FEMA bureaucracy on the issue, and
Oh,
FEMA bureaucracy moves slowly. And so
bummer.
he has sent an email this last week to deplore that it's very likely that he will be deployed and unavailable because the nature of the disaster in Hawaii or the disaster in Florida is likely to keep him compelled and confined to whatever his duties are with FEMA. And the administration is not anxious, since he's comparatively new to the program as a full-timer. He's not expecting to be released.
That's sad. That's a bummer.
Yeah, just this week that he ran into those obstacles, because previously he had it worked out that this was an advance preparation, and so it was all looking pretty good. But now it got promoted to a higher level of administration, and at that level it's been denied.
Oh, I'm sad to hear that. Are you going to be available on Sunday? Because my flight's late Sunday night.
I am going to be out of Texas and coming home Sunday afternoon.
Oh, hopefully we can shoehorn it in somehow.
I'm confident we can.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm presenting on Saturday morning, and so since they have, I think, 4 presentations going at a time. And
I hope you're not opposite me. I'm speaking on Friday and Saturday.
I think I am opposite you.
Oh no. Okay.
I do remember I'm opposite 3 other people that I'd not rather attend. But I'm thinking there may only be 2 people that come by to get a book signed, so I can maybe get into the sessions anyway.
Okay, kids. James?
I'll be quiet.
James and then Val.
Just you may have even mentioned this at the beginning of the session, or you all may be so well informed that this is a dumb question, but who owns the site currently?
It is currently owned by the LDS Church, and they have done a very good job of mowing and clearing out some of the underbrush. When I was digging there, one of the objectives was to try to figure out more about the site, and the mill race was so heavily grown with briars and stinging nettles that it was nearly impossible to approach. The Coit brothers chopped their way through the nettles, and so we put a test of squares across it, and on the north side of that mill race, at 18 inches below the surface, we encountered the hard packed zone of Mormon period occupation with Mormon period pottery. And so I'm pretty confident that the mill race would have had a structure adjacent to it. And because the overgrowth did not provide us a convenient approach, then that was something we never got to. But I am confident that we can identify. One of the stories is of the 6 little girls being shepherded across the stream, and they were hidden under the, or in the cellar, I believe it was, of one of the houses at Hawn's Mill. And for those 6 girls to be hustled across the stream and not get hit with the musket balls was considered rather miraculous. Well, the houses that they could have been hidden in must have been along the mill race, and so that's part of the area that we did not get to do a significant amount of testing. And so I would recommend for the LDS Church that they do that first. There's several other structures on the site that I think can be identified with what we have on the Ross house. We don't know whose house it was in the Mormon period, but to be able to try to figure out who would have lived where, I think is within reason. And there's clearly a good deal of room for pursuing the other structures. The Hamlet probably had a dozen or so buildings on it, and we've only really identified the precise location of one, but probable location of the blacksmith shop, and probable location of the one where Mr. McGuire was chopped down with a corn knife. That's down near the mill race.
Okay, so I apologize for not knowing this stuff. Is there any kind of monument or visitor center or anything like that on the site currently, or is it just like a post with a marker on it?
There was a 1941, I believe it was, Setzer marker established with a ceremony in the early 1940s. That marker was the benchmark that we used for our GPS readings and for our mapping when I was there. After the Mormons, the LDS people acquired it, they moved that benchmark, and so in terms of measurements from the benchmark for the mapping purposes, we've kept that obscure because we didn't want piracy to get in, but we did want that to be accurate so that any future excavation could be facilitated. And so we have both the GPS readings and the mapping stratigraphy, or the mapping coordinates to show where we dug and where we think things were. But we do not want to publish enough to make it so that other pirates would get in and further disrupt the site.
Okay, because the site is not manned. In other words, there's no visitor center
again,
or
that 1980, the 1941 Setzer marker is the only thing there. Pictures I showed at the beginning of here, let me go back to it. See I'm not screen sharing, am I?
No.
Okay, if I go to screen sharing back here, there now, this is looking from the current parking lot past the teardrop, where the teardrop was, down toward where the big tree is just beyond where I think the mill would have been. And off to the right was the knoll that we call the Ross home knoll. Now, when you're looking back at the car, looking back at the parking lot from the west, you can see the dark zones here where the vegetation shows where we had the squares, and this is where the Ross home was. That's on the first knoll west, and then the next one west was the terrace where we found most of the prehistoric material. And let me go back down here. Here's the mill race with the pool here, and so I think that I'm standing pretty close to where the mill would have been. We've been looking farther south, but the stream has moved farther south to the point that we had 20 feet of movement in 50 years to find that plastic diaper. So here's the mill race as it is today.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, there's at least in LDS culture, there's this mania for forming family organizations. Won't call it mania, a propensity for forming family organizations, not only by inheritance, but by descendants from important events. Like I know that there's an organization of descendants of people who migrated on the ship Brooklyn, and there's organizations for people who are in the Martin and Willie handcart companies and so forth. Was there, since I'm now hearing that there are people who know they are descendants of survivors of Hahn's Mill, or the people who were at Hahn's Mill whose children survived, has there been any kind of organization of those descendants who might be in a position to be influential on what is done with the site as far as memorials or so forth?
My understanding is that there is, but we have hands up of people that may be able to better answer that. So I'm going to yield to Val or Terry.
Okay.
I can't answer that question. The question I had was, what do we know? Was Hawn actually there at the time of the massacre? And beyond that, how much was destroyed? What was destroyed and what was left after the attack? Did they just were buildings destroyed in the attack? Or I know a lot of people killed in the blacksmith shop, but was the buildings burned or anything? And how long did Hawn stay after?
Good questions. To the best of my knowledge, there was no destruction of buildings. However, they did scavenge and emptied buildings of booty from the war. I mean, they claimed anything of value that the people in the militia wanted. But to the best of my knowledge, they did not burn anything. So the mill continued functioning with Mr. Ross's occupation for, I think, some years afterwards, at least I think until 1848. And beyond that, I'm not sure. The sense of we do have a few artifacts. I showed that button from 1845. So there's some evidence of the later occupation, but not a whole lot of it. So it would appear that it was not used as heavily as it had been used during the Mormon period.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm not sure I got everything covered you asked about there, Val.
Yeah, that's fine. Good.
Okay.
Bill Shepherd had his hand waving at me. So Bill, did you have a question?
I did. I keep not being able to get through, but I was wondering, were the folks, was it true that the Mormons at the mill were warned not to stay there, but they didn't adhere to that and they should have gone on to Far West, or what's the truth?
There is the account by which Joseph Smith did give a warning. However, that, as often happens with the prophetic warning, there was serious question about the intent and how urgent the matter of moving was. Jacob Hawn was not a Mormon. That provided a little bit more security for the Mormons to be there, because who would think that the Missourians would attack a non-Mormon's mill holdings just because he happened to have some Mormons on the ground. And so I understand that there was a message from Joseph Smith to indicate that people should be gathering to Far West. However, when people gathered to Far West and the militia came in to Far West to arrest Joseph and the other leaders and take them to jail at Liberty, the question of how much more secure they were at Far West than they appeared to be at Hawn's Mill, I think leaves anyone that's objective about it in doubt as to which was the safer place to go.
About how many Mormons were there at the mill?
There were several that escaped. A few that escaped with wounds, and then there were several women and children that escaped up Escape Hill. Escape Hill is to the south of Shoal Creek, and there is a remains of a stone wall up on the hill. And we do have the story of one of the Mormons who escaped, got up on that stone wall and watched, and got picked off at a range of something over 300 yards by some lucky marksman who was very proud of his marksmanship. And that gentleman, I've forgotten his name right now, but he was killed in the process. And there were a couple of people that were buried not in the well, but after they pulled away and died and were buried elsewhere. One of them in the cemetery that is up on the hill. So yeah, you do have a scattering there, and Yeah, there were probably 30 or so people at Hahn's Mill at the time of the attack.
Thank you.
Okay, Terry and then Rick.
Go to Rick first.
Rick first. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I since I've studied this, I know some of these answers, Bill. So my understanding is Jacob Hahn did go to Joseph Smith and say, "What should we do?" And Joseph Smith told Jacob Hahn that they should leave, but Jacob Hahn did not forward that message to the people at Hahn's Mill, and so there has been in fact, I remember in my interview with Alex Baugh, he said, one of the descendants said, "I'm sorry, my great grandfather didn't listen." He says, "No, your grandfather never heard the warning because Jacob Hahn didn't want to vacate because he was making a lot of money and he didn't think it would turn out so bad." I mean, because Joseph Smith did say, well, if they'd have only listened, but the problem was Jacob didn't forward the message to the people, and Jacob was a non-Mormon. And so that's kind of why he wanted to stay, because it was worth a lot of money. And so anyway, so the message didn't get through to the people, and that's a big reason why they didn't leave. So did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what I understand is right after the massacre, it was such a horrible thing. Basically, Jacob Hahn picked up and headed for Oregon and built another mill in Oregon, and I guess lived out his days there. So it was definitely scarred everybody. But basically, the people didn't get the message because Jacob Hahn didn't forward it to them. So.
Well, and the young family that had come from Kirtland had, I think, gotten there and were just there camping for 3 days. So to imagine having traveled from July to October to be on the spot in time to be killed, rather a sad commentary for that family.
Yeah, really sad. So, there's another thing. I'll just add this really quickly with regards to the extermination order. That came a few days before. I can't remember if it was a day before, shortly before the massacre happened.
October 27th, and the massacre was on the 30th.
30th, that sounds right. And so Alex Baugh said, "There's no way in that time." He said he thinks if the Missourians had received the extermination order, they would not have carried out the massacre because he was trying to get them out of the state. And so, they didn't have telegrams, they didn't have, everything, the communication was just so much slower. And so the people killed were not a result of the extermination order. And Alex thinks that if they had found out about it, then it probably wouldn't have happened at all. So kind of interesting.
Well, and there were a number of people involved. The gentleman that had the mill that is now at the city of Dawn, which is the next one downstream, was one of the people in that militia. A number of the people in the militia had economic benefits by getting rid of the Mormons, and so those economic. Mike Griggs would be making the point that that the economic interests of the people of surrounding counties, and particularly the fact that the Mormons were vying for contracts with Fort Leavenworth, which were major contracts for grain and also road building, that the fact the Mormons were competing against those who were slave owners who felt like they had the right to govern the state made it so that was a compelling interest, whether Governor Boggs issued his order or not.
Yeah. I think my internet's not working very well right now. It's kind of cutting in and out on me, but hopefully you can hear me. I think Bill also asked about the burning of buildings.
Yes.
To my understanding, it was just a shootout. There weren't any burned buildings or anything. The blacksmith shop was not finished, and basically it was logs that had when you take a log cabin, usually you fill it in, you chink it, you put in mud and stuff to fill in the holes, and it had not been chinked yet. And so when all the Mormons moved into the blacksmith shop thinking it was a place of refuge, basically all of the attackers just pointed their guns in those holes, and it was like shooting fish in a barrel. It was terrible. And so it ended up being a death trap rather than a place of refuge. So it's a terrible thing. But there are no burned buildings as far as I'm aware, unless Paul knows differently.
No, I'm in agreement. As far as I could tell, the charcoal that we found was pre-Mormon, except for the charcoal accompanied by the burned granite that would have been in preparing the mill wheels. Terry yielded.
All right. Thanks, Terry, for letting me jump out of order.
Yeah, I yielded to you because I knew what you were going to contribute that I wasn't. So anyway, my question is, with all the trees that line that creek, looking at the video, the photographs you have, there's some really young trees and yet there's some older trees. Is there any way to date the movement of the stream from the trees?
No, but I've been able to date them with the increment borer. And so we had a project that's mentioned in the book in which we went through the big trees with increment borer to try to find, because we had a lady who was giving tours on the site who was pointing out that certain trees were there at the time of the battle. Well, the trees that she was pointing to were less than 100 years old. Now, the soil is very soft and moist there, and trees grow very fast. There are 3 trees on the site that were all big oaks that, because oak is very difficult to work with and with the increment borer, unless you can happen to get lucky and bore right into the center of it, then you're not likely to get an accurate picture of the actual age of the tree. But there are 3 oaks that might possibly have gone back to the period, and we attempted to get those readings, but did not get fortunate enough to get an accurate core to the center. So therefore, the best I can tell you is probably not. There's probably not a single tree on that bottomland that is still alive from the time of the battle.
That's kind of what I thought, given what I know about the trees in Nauvoo. Some of those trees look huge, but they're not nearly as old as people think they are.
Exactly.
And so in a
point.
wetland like that, those trees grow fast and they're younger than they look. So thank you.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And it was a bit surprising for me to hear a self-appointed guide pointing to the trees that actually still had the bullets in them. It's pretty tough to have bullets in them from an activity that happened 50 years or 100 years earlier.
Okay, Monty, go ahead, please.
Well, my picture of the people that attacked the folks at Hahn's Mill is a group of people that the core group in the middle, at least, was a mob of people that were thirsting for blood. And even if the rest of the guys were just kind of going along because they'd been told to go, this group was determined to the point where orders wouldn't have made any difference to them anyway. They traveled all that distance to kill folks, and by golly, they were going to kill folks. And so that's how I see it.
Well, I'd like to disabuse you of that feeling, Monty, because while that is a traditional vantage point from the Mormon perspective, if you look back at the Battle of Crooked River, which the Mormons won, and the Missourians fled the battle scene and reported the carnage that they'd been through, which wasn't really very much, but they got scared and so they ran, and so they made up stories. But to have a private militia defeat the state militia is not a tolerable situation in any state. And so, to the extent that these were Missouri regulars, they were under the leadership of the Missouri militia. Yes, there was a certain mob atmosphere about it, but put it back in the legal context, Missouri was allowed in the United States by the Compromise of 1820 as a slave state. It became a state in 1821. Blacks were constitutionally recognized as slaves, and the only way that a black person could not be a slave was if they carried the certificate to show that they were free. And so if you strip that certificate away from a black person, he suddenly becomes a slave again in Missouri. So when Elijah Lovejoy saw the lynching of a black man who was free and burning at the stake while he was alive, and he wrote about that in St. Louis, then his press got destroyed, and the case went to court. Judge Lawless ruled that people who were involved in a mob no longer responsible for their own behavior, and so he declared that no one was guilty of the murder. And Elijah Lovejoy wrote about that, and again his press got destroyed. So he went across the river and got another press. Missourian slave owners went after him. They got that press as well and shot him 5 times and killed him. Now you're dealing here with a quasi-legal context for Missouri and Missouri's political leadership to use the rules, use the laws they had set up to their own advantage. And so if you're a law-abiding citizen in Missouri, you don't look at that history as a mob conducting a massacre at Hawn's Mill. It's merely an incident in the Mormon War.
Well, I'm not talking about history. I'm talking about human nature.
For those of you interested in additional information on Hawn's Mill, Rick has his interview with Alex Baugh. The link is in the chat if you're interested in that. And Rick is also asking Paul if those musket balls that you found date to Hawn's Mill.
Yes. Yes, they are matched with the guns that would have been used by the Missouri militia. And there are I think, 3 different sizes, so we're dealing both with muskets and pistols.
You're muted, Rick.
I thought I clicked it. So, Paul, you think those likely were part of the battle at Hawn's Mill there?
Not necessarily everything, and we did find shell casings, shotgun shells, and so forth that are more modern, because it's been a hunter's paradise for deer and turkey in the modern world as well. And but in terms of the musket balls, yeah, I would say the pattern of where we found them would again suggest it. And the fact that we found additional pieces of lead that would have been used for melting down more ammunition does speak of it being a battle scene.
Thanks.
High school students did a very good job in that kind of a study. I mean, it's one of the fascinating things is that things like those musket balls got priority attention from the high school students because, yeah, if we had a massacre here and here's the musket balls, that's pretty exciting stuff. And so that paper is the one that we put in the book, just so people could see the kind of work that a high school student could produce. Here I guess there wasn't any time for Mike Riggs to speak tonight anyway, was there? Thank you all for your questions, comments. I hope this has been adequately tied to the Book of Mormon so that it's been instructive as well. I recognize that it's a sad chapter in Missouri history, It's an even sadder chapter in Mormon history.
Well, you did a super job of telling us about it.
It strikes me as being something from which we need to learn, because if we're going to build Zion of peace, Mormons had that in mind when they went to independence, but they did a botched up job of it. When W.W. Phelps set up the press, he paid no attention to the people that were local. He just simply was telling the story of the Mormons. And when you offend the local people and are not a good neighbor, then that's a tough way to get along. And so for us to learn to be good neighbors and to be able to respect our neighbors as God's children, people of worth and value, part of the community of Zion that we need to be working on establishing, it makes a difference as we approach our friends and neighbors with the attitudes that we carry. And
Well,
I
this
think
is
it's quite
Kansas.
clear.
All of my neighbors have AR-15.
Yeah, we're facing some of that today. Yeah, there's still some of this mob action available. I look at the Missouri politics and I wonder just how much improvement we've seen. Well, we are approaching 10 o'clock.
The only political sign I put in my front yard was Jean-Luc Picard for president.
Paid for by?
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Paul.
Go ahead, Ethan.
So, as far as I'm aware, David Whitmer and some higher church officials were excommunicated like 6 months prior.
Yes.
So in that area where a lot of Mormons were settling, were there any of these dissenters? Like, maybe there's a reason that this was targeted? Maybe there's like political infighting, and maybe somebody was from in the church was making money or something and in cahoots with the militia, and they're like, yeah, there's a settlement here, there's actually some people that we don't want. They're causing trouble. Maybe they had a printing press or something like that, and they wanted to get rid of it. I know it's kind of far out, but what do you think?
There was a good deal of distress and disagreement, but the people like David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, who had been kicked out of the church, were still strong advocates for the Book of Mormon. They were not interested in seeing people killed. I do recognize that we do have some hints, particularly in the battles of Millport and Gallatin, that there may have been some pretty serious backbiting there. But in terms of the Hans Mill massacre, I know of no evidence of ex-Mormon contribution.
Okay, yeah, because I'm referring to like the group known as the Danites, I believe.
Right.
So this secret organization that was, from my understanding, they were more militant.
Yes.
So maybe they had influence, or I'm just wondering if maybe there was, because I read that David Whitmer settled in that area within the Kansas City area. So, it's not like people are moving back to Ohio. These dissenters are kind of staying within the broader region, but, moving out of the way, I guess. And I'm wondering if there was, because it seems like it was a major settlement, or one of the more major settlements at that time of Mormons at Hans Mill.
David Whitmer stayed in the region within 50 miles of Hans Mill, I think, for the rest of his life. The Danites, I think, were a contributing factor to the hostilities because they were inclined to use their muscle and military might to damage people that they thought were damaging the Mormons. And so the idea, well, for example, at Anabon the Hawn, after Millport and Gallatin were sieged or were embattled, there was a gathering of materials that had been taken from those towns, and it was stored at Lyman White's house. Since Lyman White was in prison at Liberty, clearly he couldn't be held responsible, and so ultimately the sheriff was able to redistribute some of that goods back to the original owners. So yes, there was a certain amount of chicanery that the Danites were involved in, and that's a tough one to read because clearly they were fundamentally working in secret. We have some of their testimony afterwards, and there's a question about how much of that is reliable. So, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any clear evidence of Danite involvement in stirring up in contributing to the massacre, but clearly their involvement was part of what led to the extermination order.
And if I can just jump in there, yeah, I don't think they were involved in the massacre at all. And I think Ethan said that Hawn's Mill was a large settlement. No, it was a tiny settlement. Just a few families.
Probably not more than 12 buildings in the hamlet is my best guess.
Yeah, it's very small. And I'm trying to remember the Alex Baugh. We get into a lot more details with Hawn's Mill because that was kind of the focus of the interview. I do know that there was the Mormons raided something nearby Hawn's Mill and burned homes and things like that. And so in retaliation, the Missourians were like, "Oh, here's this little settlement here. We're going to revenge," but they were revenging on people that had nothing to do with the Danites or anything like that. They were just like, "We're going to go kill some Mormons." So there was a lot going on. And maybe I should also mention I did another interview with Steve LeSueur. So we talk a little bit about Hawn's Mill, but it's more of a minor piece in our interview. But he talks about the 1838 Mormon-Missouri War in general, and he definitely puts a lot more blame on Danites. But I think in both Alex and Steve's case, both of them agree that the people in Hawn's Mill were completely blameless and just innocent victims of this terrible war.
I think it may be useful to understand that many of the people that were involved in the Crooked River battle were aware that their lives were in jeopardy, and they took off. Many of them headed directly north to Iowa and then over to Illinois. And so there's several that got out of state by about the time the Hawn's Mill massacre occurred that would have been the ones that the Missourians were really after. And so, yes, the idea that they should hit Hawn's Mills and hit people who were totally innocent is one of the sad things about the chunk of history.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I just added a link to my interview with Steve LeSueur, although I do have another one coming up.
Oh, good.
We're going to get into the Wild West next time, but nothing to do with Missouri.
I understand that he's been diagnosed with cancer.
Steve has?
That's my understanding.
Oh, I did not know that. I didn't hear that.
I think Mike Riggs told me that.
Oh, that's terrible. He's a good guy.
Yeah, sad to hear. But we can pray for him. All right. Well, if any other questions, we'll have the lady sing here. And then if you want to continue to discuss, you may. Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. And thank you for all your questions and comments. I appreciate this forum and the remarkable audience you people are.
Thanks, Paul.
Paul, I have a presentation ready. You had asked me to maybe have something ready for September, and I have something ready to go pretty much whenever you want to.
Okay. September 25 is available.
All right. I'll pencil that in and plan to do a presentation. It's on